The Dead Zone was Stephen King's fifth novel, or the seventh, if you count the Richard Bachman books. It was published in 1979. Every single one of Stephen King's books has, at this point, sold millions of copies. But comparing it to the rest of his work, like, The Stand, or It, or The Shining, or a plethora of different works that he's done, it just doesn't stand out quite as much as the others. It just gets outshined by the others. It's not that it's per se a weak novel, others are just much more popular. That said, I actually think The Dead Zone is probably one of the better novels from this period of his career, the really early portion of his career. Not that I've read everything that he's done, but it's the most literary that I've read so far. While I am going to level a few criticisms at this, I do think that this is one of King's more important works. Even though he has many more entertaining works than The Dead Zone, this one's actually fairly important, especially if you're an American. It's pretty short for a Stephen King novel. It clocks in at 402 pages. That's about 171,000 words. Although Stephen King is known for horror, I would argue that this is not really a horror novel. It's kind of just a meditation on loss, a little bit of a thriller, but altogether, it's not horror. There's a little bit of science fiction undertones in there, a little bit of romance in there, a romantic subplot. Like I said just a moment ago, the most literary of all of Stephen King's work. It really strips away a lot of the bells and whistles of your typical Stephen King novel and just leaves you with a little dissertation about just how sometimes life deals you a bad hand, and sometimes you just have to go along with that bad hand and do the best that you possibly can with it, regardless of how hard that might be and the outcomes, the personal cost that you might have to sacrifice to be able to attain it as well. Weighed with the greater good, of course, as to whether or not sacrificing enough of yourself is worth it for the benefit of everybody else. That said, let's go ahead and get into the plot and the prose here. A school teacher named Johnny Smith survives a near-fatal car accident, but is plunged into a 4-year coma. When he emerges, he finds the love of his life has moved on for another man. His mother has fallen prey to a religious delusion, and America has suffered national embarrassment following the Nixon administration and through each presidency thereafter. And if life hadn't been cruel enough, the accident awakened a future sight ability within Johnny, a blessing and a curse that ultimately reveals to him the apocalyptic future in store for humanity, and he is the only one who could stop it. Even though the book is particularly slow-paced, for a Stephen King novel, because it's so short, it still does fly by pretty quickly. And, to boot, even though it is slow, he does make good use of it. Stephen King takes a lot of time to set some stuff up that won't come into play much later into the novel. Although I think that the book could have used a little bit of structural editing, we'll discuss that in a little bit, overall, it wasn't enough to make me dislike the book. I think it could have just been changed and strengthened some, but don't mistake that for me saying that this was bad or poorly done in any way, shape, or form. I think it was, one of Stephen King's better novels. The prose itself is better than most of Stephen King's early work. Comparing it to Carrie, Salem's Lot, The Stand, so on and so forth, I definitely feel like he was on a better trajectory as a writer. He was getting stronger as a writer, as naturally he should. I can't quite put my finger on what exactly is, but there's a very specific flavor that is different in his first, I want to say 10 books or so. There is, unfortunately, not too much tension in the book until the very end. The climax, of course, is a bit tense. There are really high stakes at the end of the book, but for the most part, it's just a slow, very slow burn. We spend a lot of time with our protagonist just dealing with his grief and his sorrow and just the ramifications of having to have survived the coma. So it's, not to mention how difficult it must be to actually grow that psychic ability and be helplessly unable to stop yourself from seeing into people's minds whenever you come in contact, and how that changes your relationship between people and how they even look at you, let alone want to come in contact with you. Even the worst books that Stephen King has written that I've read, even those ones still had characters that were fully fleshed out. I didn't like some of those books. Black House, for instance. Hated that book. I really didn't like that one. But you can't say that they didn't flesh the characters out. Stephen King always does that. Even his small side characters that really only show up for like 1 or 2 scenes or whatever, he's usually able to make them feel filled out and alive. He leaves very few stones unturned when it comes to character work. So Johnny Smith is our protagonist. He's the one that has survived the car crash, he has the psychic abilities, and overall, it's really easy to like Johnny. King describes him as tall and not particularly handsome, although he's pretty intelligent, he's pretty charismatic, fairly funny. John Smith is obviously an extremely common name, right? And Stephen King pokes fun at that like once or twice throughout the book. I've wondered why. Why exactly did he decide to name him John Smith? It seemed a little, I don't know, just odd. I think that he's trying to argue that the average person has some sort of a responsibility to interact with politics. Herb and Vera Smith, those are Johnny's parents. And when it comes to Herb, I didn't like him at first, but he really grows on you, right? He's very stressed out when we meet him, so he's really flying off the handle, not treating his wife particularly nice. Sure, she may be freaking out and pissing him off, but that doesn't excuse anything. You don't be an asshole just because you're pissed off. That's not the right way to go about things. And so that got me off on the wrong foot with her, but he did at least redeem himself later on, right? He shows that he tries to care for his wife and all that kind of stuff. He shows that he still cares for his son and does feel guilty about some of the things that he considers a mistake. He does try to reflect and be a good person throughout the book, even if when you meet him, it's just a little bit like, Jesus Christ, fucking calm down. Vera Smith is a really important character, though. His mother, oh my god, she absolutely broke my heart. Just her character arc really just, it was really sad. Vera was perfectly written for the story that she was in, and unfortunately kind of breaks my heart just because, like, I've seen so many people follow that same path that she's gone down. You know, she buys into some really wacky, crazy shit, and she rides it all the way to the moon. She buys all the way in and refuses to see the truth. I see Vera in a lot of people in America, unfortunately. Vera is a very common attitude in America, not because of any specific thing that any person does, but because they're responding to the environment around them, responding to the things that happen, right? You know, Vera goes crazy because her son goes into a coma. And that's something that she can't psychologically handle, right? You know, people all around us have a hard time psychologically handling themselves and the world around us because of the pressures that exist in their daily lives. And so, oh man, Vera breaks my heart, but she's one of the most important characters. Sarah was Johnny's girlfriend before he ends up getting into the car wreck and going into the coma. Sarah's fine. I liked her just fine. You know, she carries around a lot of guilt for, you know, what happens to Johnny. She kind of blames herself in some ways, and, you know, it's not her fault, of course, right? It's very clear from the get-go that, of course, it's not her fault. But she still blames herself a lot and really kind of has a little bit of remorse for how things have turned out. She feels like she's almost the other shoe-in for the average person, where it's like she just kind of floats along and accepts what she gets and doesn't really want to change too much stuff. She wants to put old stuff to bed so she doesn't have to think about it too much anymore. But unfortunately, it keeps popping up all throughout her life. The romance that she and Johnny share is by no means a bad romance. It's not awful, but he's also written much better romances before, so you know, it's fine for what we have. It serves the purpose in the story that it needs to. It doesn't really get too in the way of all of the other important, much more important aspects of the book. Greg Stilson is the antagonist of the book, and all I'm going to say about him is that Stephen King very recently stated that Greg Stilson is just Donald Trump, so do with that what you will. Welcome to the spoiler section, so if you do not want any spoilers, have a good day. Let's start with my biggest issue with this book. My biggest issue is the Frank Dodd situation. I got two big problems. First of all, there really needed to be a better resolution with Frank Dodd. Johnny goes to the police station, he meets Frank Dodd, and we understand later that in that moment, Frank kind of sees him and knows it, and then goes home, kills himself. It just feels like a little bit of a cop-out, right? Thematically, it makes sense for Frank Dodd to have killed himself, to have, I don't know, robbed us of that satisfaction, because, like, the end of the book is kind of also robbing us of our satisfaction. We'll get to that stuff in a minute. But think if we added a second action scene in, right there at the Frank Dodd portion, it would have been better. And we're not even talking a long action scene. I'm talking tiny. We could be like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 paragraphs maximum. He doesn't have to make a whole chapter out of it or nothing. I'm just saying a little bit of something more than just finding Frank Dodd dead. The second reason why I have issue with the Frank Dodd stuff here is because it did not tie into the Greg Stilson stuff, like, at all. That happens, and then just like then the Laughing Tiger part of the book happens, and it's like, oh, okay, well, I mean, like, we're almost reading two different stories, like a story and then its sequel. It almost feels like the Greg Stilson part was kind of an afterthought that Stephen King was having while they were leading up to the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan, honestly. And so he just took The Dead Zone, which was this story about, a psychic who helps solve a murder, and he just kind of like adds in the Greg Stilson thing. Well, that's fine, right? There's nothing wrong with adding a new thing into your book here, but it could have been done a lot better, because, say for instance, we have to change one more thing if we're going to do this. Say for instance, instead of Greg Stilson running in the 3rd District of New Hampshire, what if we pull a fucking Stephen King and set it in Maine instead? He runs in the 3rd District of Maine, where Castle Rock happens to be. Well, that'd be interesting, because after the whole Castle Rock killer thing is finished up, Greg Stilson now has a reason to throw a political rally in Castle Rock. He wants to go shake the hand of the man that solved the case. That's going to be political points for George Stilson, and it's going to give us a reason for Johnny to shake his hand, other than the reasons that King set up for us, which was more or less just like, I'm curious about how the politics of this works out. Which, like, again, fine. It was fine. It was fair enough. It was good enough how it came out to not only get me through the book, but to believe that this is one of King's more important novels. So it's not bad the way that it was done. I just think he really could have strengthened it if, instead of setting Greg Stilson in New Hampshire, he should have had that in Maine, so that he had it would just tie it together a little stronger, I think. Granted, this would have taken a lot of rewriting, this would have taken a lot of structural upheaval in the novel, but at the end of the day, I think it would have been worth it. So, okay, Vera being sucked into the religious cult relates a lot to people being sucked into the cult of Greg Stilson. Even though it wasn't exactly called that, you could tell that that's what it is, right? Vera started getting very temperamental whenever any of her ideals were questioned, while people started getting very temperamental whenever ideals about Greg Stilson were questioned. And so, man, you can see that type of behavior happen in America a lot these days. Americans really like to put ourselves into cults. And I'm not saying that because, I'm trying to insult any of the Americans. I am an American too, right? I'd rather not insult myself if I can avoid it. We do that. We put ourselves into cults. We like to. It's what we do, and we really need to change that if we really ever want to genuinely avoid electing Greg Stilson again, because we've done it twice now. The only way to avoid that is to stop putting ourselves into cults. America cannot actually genuinely begin its healing process until the cults and cult-like thinking is genuinely demolished and abolished completely, and real education comes in and usurps it. Moving on from Vera, we have to discuss Johnny missing his shot. It's very frustrating emotionally. You're reading it, you're like, you really want him to pop one into Greg Stilson, but overall, thinking it through, it's best that he didn't, of course, because what would have happened if Greg Stilson was shot? Another Greg Stilson would come to take his place. He would be venerated. Greg Stilson had a very unique power in Congress, in Washington. He had a very unique presence, and when that allowed him to have a specific kind of power. And if Greg Stilson had been shot and killed, he would have left a power vacuum after that, and people would have rushed in to fill that. And people who were primed to be in the cult of Greg Stilson would still be primed to be in the cult of something else. And so it would only hinder things in the long run. So the only real way that this book could have ended was the way that it ended, was Greg Stilson grabbing that baby and trying to hide behind that baby. It was showing him for the real snake that he is, the real monster that he actually is. The Dead Zone very much stresses how important it is to identify the bullshit that your politicians feed you. And That definitely goes for in America, very much for in America. That goes for everywhere else, though, as well, right? You know, it doesn't matter what country you're in, it doesn't matter what town you're in, your government does matter. Johnny Smith is almost a shoo-in for the experts in general, right? You know, climate scientists, a doctor that studies viruses, a mechanic that has worked on engines for 36 years, anybody who's well-versed in their field. Johnny Smith, I think, is supposed to be that. That's what he's supposed to represent. We are supposed to listen to the people who are well-versed in what they know. John Smith is representative of that because he's psychic, right? He knows things. What does a master at something do but know everything about it? So because John Smith is a master, and he's supposed to be the shoo-in for every possible kind of master of anything, I think that's suggesting that we need to listen to the people who know what they're talking about. John Smith knows things. We need to listen to him because he knows things. People need to listen to Johnny, right? You know, during the fire, they don't listen to him that there's going to be a lightning strike, and it strikes, and it kills a bunch of people. Why? Because Johnny wasn't listened to. The only people that listen to Johnny happens to survive. And specifically, Johnny is kind of an expert in his own field anyway, which is English. He is a teacher and goes out to be he goes on to tutor later on in the book. The final critique that I have with this book is actually really small and pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it bothered me from the moment we got through the scene and it wasn't addressed. I usually don't care about sex scenes in stories, right? I just don't like them. They're just not for me, right? But there is one in this book, and it's fairly short, fairly tasteful, but one major problem. When Johnny has sex, he doesn't have his psychic flash, and it was explicitly set up in this book that whenever he touches people, he gets those psychic flashes, right? Like, it just happens inadvertently, very frequently. So, like, why isn't he getting psychic flashes while he's getting laid? That would probably make it really difficult to pay attention to the act, and would probably have drastically changed the scene if that was introduced. I wonder if Stephen King probably did attempt that, but had to edit that part out. In conclusion, The Dead Zone is kind of outshined by most of the rest of Stephen King's work. It was far from great, but because of how important I think the message is, I think I'm going to go ahead and give it a B+. The few problems that it had were far outweighed by its strong characters, its moral quandaries, and its eerie, accurate critiques. And it remains one of his wisest and most pointedly critical novels more than 45 years after its publication. Would I reread this novel? I'm not going to say yes, but I'm certainly not taking it off the table. As much as I enjoy Stephen King, I really do want to branch out and read new authors. Plus, there is a bunch of Stephen King that I've not read. I've only made it about halfway through his books at this point. My name is Damien, by the way. I'm also an author. My debut novel was The Circus, an American fantasy. I also wrote Portraits and Bloodlines, short stories with my father, Rick Foreman, and the stage play 666, or a play about stones and how to carry them. I travel southern Arizona to sell my books and used fiction as well. Check my website for a calendar as to where I'm going to be. Thank you for watching. Have a good one.